Okay. Well, we still have a few minutes before we start. My mom was logged in, but I think we lost her. Hello. What was that, Jim? Okay. It sounds like you're fighting with a piece of tape.
I was looking at earbuds.
Okay.
I think they're going to work in that.
Yeah. Okay. This part of the video will be really confusing for the people that are watching the stream on YouTube because they won't be able to hear anything that happens in Discord.
Did you mention when they should fast forward to?
I haven't got that far yet. Well, normally we have a lot more chatter before the stream starts, but no one's here because everyone's at home.
I'm here.
This is very weird.
So where do we see this?
The stream is on our YouTube channel. We had one that was scheduled to start, but we set that up incorrectly. So there's a second stream called Matthew 28 that we set up, and it's live now. So if you want to see delayed video of me with my ridiculous headphones on, um, that's on the YouTube channel. Let me grab the link and post it. What?
I'm doing that.
Okay. Where are you posting it?
The Grovetown Facebook.
I was going to put it in Discord. Look, there's me.
Discord.
Mm-hmm. I look really confused in that photo too.
I see you now.
Yep. And that's how long the delay is between Discord and YouTube. So, Jim, you're using your computer speakers, aren't you?
I'm getting confused because I'm hearing it twice.
Yeah, so just mute the YouTube video.
Got it.
Yeah, that should prevent anything else.
See, this is just like watching the old Hong Kong Kung Fu movies.
That's odd. Was it there?
Mouth moves and then you hear.
There was a scene about that in Wayne's World, the movie. Mm-hmm. Still an excellent movie. Totally holds up. Okay. So it is round about 7 o'clock. I think it's close enough to time to start. So we'll go ahead and start now. For anybody watching the live stream of this later, we're working on using Discord so that we can still have some discussion. Somebody unmuted something.
Sorry.
But we have a Discord channel going so that everybody can still participate in the study, but we have no idea how to get the Discord audio into the YouTube stream. So what that means is if people in the Discord chat decide to ask questions or make comments or make fun of me, which might happen, then YouTube will have no idea what they said. So I'm going to have to repeat what you all say, which means that I'll probably edit some when you make fun of me. But that's unfortunately right now we don't have a workaround for getting the Discord audio onto the YouTube stream. I'm not smart enough to do that yet. Anyway, as normal, Lindsay is monitoring the live stream chat because I'm really bad at paying attention to both things at the same time. So today we are in Matthew 28, which is the last chapter in Matthew. And it's a fairly short chapter, so this is going to be a pretty short study, but that's okay because it's going to be really weird, I think, doing this through Discord anyway. So, we'll call this a test, an experiment. So I would say who remembers what happened last time, but last time was the chapter that deals with the whole trial and execution of Jesus. And the denial of Peter. Or was that earlier? No, that was earlier. Yeah. Okay. Peter's denial was in chapter 26. So 27, Judas hangs himself. Jesus goes in front of Pilate. They let Barabbas loose. And we talked about last week how that was related to the Jewish tradition for the scapegoat, which was part of the Day of Atonement sacrifices. So today we're picking up after Jesus has been buried. The last thing we read about in 27 was the tomb being put under guard, and there were two women mentioned, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and they saw this whole burial thing go down, and they decide that they're going to come back and do something about the embalming, or what. There was something that they had wanted to do with the body after Joseph of Arimathea. There was another guy whose name I can't remember, and the other guy buried Jesus after he had been crucified. So they couldn't do it right then because the Sabbath was coming. So chapter 28 picks up that chain of events um, the morning after the Sabbath. So chapter 28, verse 1. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, kind of sucks that she just turns into the other Mary. She had, like, her full name given in the previous chapter, but now she's just the other Mary. Went to view the tomb. Suddenly there was a violent earthquake because an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and approached the tomb. He rolled back the stone and was sitting on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his robe was as white as snow. The guards were so shaken from fear of him that they became like dead men. But the angel told the women, "Don't be afraid, because I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he has been resurrected, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead. In fact, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Listen, I have told you." So these women think that they're going to go do some work on Jesus' body, but instead they find this angel. The angel tells them that Jesus rose from the dead, which, I mean, we talked about this in the other chapters. It really shouldn't be all that surprising because Jesus said several times that he was going to die and then rise from the dead, but nobody really got it or seemed to believe him at the time. It's not clear what they thought was going to happen, but they didn't think that was going to happen. So they get told that he's risen from the dead. Then they get told, go find the disciples and tell them. Okay, so verse 8. So departing quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, they ran to tell his disciples the news. Just then Jesus met them and said, "Good morning." They came up, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus told them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there." Okay, so all this makes sense. It's pretty straightforward, really. Verse 11. As they were on their way, some of the guards came into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. After the priests had assembled with the elders and agreed on a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, "Say this: his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping. If this reaches the governor's ears, we will deal with him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been spread among Jewish people to this day. Okay, we actually talked about this subject last week when we were going over chapter 27, because when they buried Jesus, the Pharisees went to Pilate and said they needed to guard the tomb to prevent the disciples from coming and taking the body away, which is now the story that they're going with. So they're going to eventually have to explain to Pilate that despite the fact that they were guarding the body, which he gave them authority to do, they're claiming to have lost Jesus anyway. So it's kind of egg on their face, but the Pharisees don't come out of this book well ever. So that's kind of par for the course for them, really. Okay. Also, that's a fairly straightforward part. We'll pick it up at verse 16. The 11 disciples traveled to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. Then Jesus came near and said to them, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you, and remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Okay, this is actually, to me, the most important part of this chapter. The whole rest of it seems like just really straightforward narrative to me, and a lot is made over the rolling away of the stone and the angel showing up, but I think most of the interesting stuff actually happens in 16 and on. Particularly the very last verse where he says, "I'm with you always to the end of the age." Does anybody remember what we studied last Tuesday in Ezekiel? That was in Ezekiel 40 through, I want to say 43 is what we did. And that was the portion of Ezekiel that was after the several chapters describing the day of the Lord. So after that long series of talking about divine judgment, you had this series that starts talking about a restored holy city for God's people. And the climactic moment in that, after they're describing the dimensions of all the stuff in that city, is in chapter 43 of Ezekiel, where God's presence returns to Jerusalem and to the temple the same way that it left, right? And you go through the rest of Ezekiel, and there's a whole lot more dimensions. There's a whole lot more description of the land and the city, and this character is introduced called the Prince, right? But at the very end of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 48, verse 35, there's this little thing tacked on to that sentence after it finishes describing the new city. Talks about the gates. Verse 35 goes, "The perimeter of the city will be 6 miles, and the name of the city from that day on will be Yahweh is there." Okay. We've talked before about how it's very likely that Ezekiel, because of the vocabulary that Matthew uses, that Ezekiel is meant to be seen as the context, the background for Matthew. So Matthew 28 ends with the Great Commission and then God saying, "I'm with you always." Okay. Ezekiel ends with, "Yahweh is there." Well, how did the crucifixion end? The crucifixion ended with the tearing of the veil that separated God's presence in the holy place from the rest of the temple and the rest of the world, right? So at that moment in 27, there was no longer any need for separation between God and man. And then Jesus shows up and says, "I'm with you always." And the whole book long, we've been thinking about Ezekiel, and Ezekiel ends with, "Yahweh is there." So I think that Matthew wants us to see the resurrection as sort of a foreshadowing for what comes after the divine judgment that we associate with the day of the Lord. That judgment, or the whole event of the day of the Lord, is associated with divine judgment against God's enemies, destruction of evil, the complete annihilation of all the things that are destroying the world, and then the restoration of God's people, the vindication of believers, and the reestablishment of God dwelling with mankind. Okay, well, that's where Matthew ends. We get the Great Commission saying, "Go out and make disciples." But the very last verse talks about God in the flesh being with human beings. And the very last verse of Ezekiel, Yahweh is there. I think that is significant for us to remember. And I think that's part of what Matthew wanted to communicate with his book, which is that post-resurrection, post-vindication of Christ, it's not just that Jesus is alive, right? It's not just that he got resurrected, it's that he's with us. So this expectation that the Jews had for God to dwell with them was at least in part fulfilled with the resurrection of Christ, who is with us always. How does that play out? Well, we're not really told the rest in Matthew, but when Jesus ascends, of course, we have the descent of the Holy Spirit and the indwelling of believers with the Holy Spirit. Okay. That makes sense. And of course, we get a whole lot more explanation and background on this stuff in Acts and following in the epistles. But what I think Matthew is calling us to look at is that in the first century, with the resurrection of Christ, that part of the fulfillment of prophecy for God's believers and God's nation started to be fulfilled. That's obviously not finished being fulfilled, but started to be fulfilled. And like we've said before, there's a lot of already and there's a lot of not yet. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that? Those of you who are listening on Discord right now? I didn't hear anything. Yeah? Are you there? Well, I'm not hearing anybody. No, I'm hearing somebody's feeding back.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. Well, actually, I hadn't really considered the part of connecting Ezekiel with Matthew.
Yeah.
Matthew using those symbols. That makes a lot of sense.
So for those of you watching on the stream, that was Jim mentioning that he hadn't thought before about Matthew and Ezekiel being connected, but it does make sense. Okay. So the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that this whole idea of the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations, that begins at least to be fulfilled in the book of Acts. And I'm actually going to flip over there and find that because it's sort of relevant to the discussion. So in the book of Acts, when Peter gives his sermon in chapter 2, there's people there who come from all over the world. There is this interesting bit when Peter starts speaking and all the guys are like, oh, how come we can hear Peter in our own language? It talks about Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those who live in Mesopotamia and Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking of the magnificent acts of God in our own languages. That was Acts 2, 8 through 11. Okay, so all of those places that are mentioned, why would the writer of Acts, Luke, why would Luke bother to mention all those places if there wasn't some significance there? Well, all those places represent what's basically the known world at that time in the first century. So the idea is when you get to Acts, you start seeing things being fulfilled that were associated with the Messianic kingdom. And specifically relevant to our Matthew 28 discussion, you see disciples from all nations, or at least all nations that they're aware of, being made immediately in response to Peter's sermon at Pentecost. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing. Any questions or comments about that from the Discord group? It is. So Joel said in the Discord group that he thought it was interesting that we just happened to be going through Matthew and Ezekiel, which are related to each other. I wish I could say that I planned that. I totally didn't. Um, but it is interesting just how interconnected they are. Um, the context of Matthew seems to relate back to Ezekiel really, really often. And I think it really, really helps to understand what exactly Matthew was trying to communicate when you look at how Ezekiel talks about some of the same ideas that Matthew makes reference to. But the when Matthew refers back to them, it's in the context of Jesus fulfilling ideas that get talked about in Ezekiel. So that would have been really interesting and unexpected at the time, because the Jews would have had one set of expectations for how the day of the Lord would go. And then Matthew shows up and starts pointing at things and saying, well, it was fulfilled this way, or at least using those as context for things that Jesus did. But nobody would have expected the resurrection of Christ and the descent of the Holy Spirit to be part of the way that Ezekiel 48 could take shape, or part of the way that God being with people would make any sense. Because previously, there had been no continuous indwelling of God's Holy Spirit with believers in God on large scale. I mean, the Old Testament makes reference of people being dwelled or indwelled by the Holy Spirit briefly, temporarily, but never permanently. That was just something that, God's Spirit would come upon them and they would do a thing like prophesy, and then he would leave. So the the stuff that we get talked about relating to Jesus dwelling with mankind, that's very novel stuff. And relating it back to Old Testament prophecy is a very unexpected way for the Jews to see that fulfilled. Do we have any other comments or questions tonight? If not, it's a pretty short study. There's only, 20 verses in Matthew 28, and they're pretty much all narrative. There's not, I could make up a bunch of stuff to talk about, but what was that, Lindsay?
Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday. Lindsay wants me to mention Palm Sunday because it's Palm Sunday as we're writing this, but nobody knows that it's Palm Sunday because we're all hiding in our houses, and nobody went to church and got palm leaves thrown at them today. Does anybody have Palm Sunday related stuff to say? You can type it, or you can unmute your microphone or whatever. If we were really smart, we would have timed our journey through Matthew's gospel so that Palm Sunday related to the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But we did that weeks ago because we didn't really plan this all that well. So anyway, there it is. A weird, surreal, historical Palm Sunday where no one's out celebrating it because they're all hiding in their house. So anything else anyone wants to bring up? Probably not. I think we'll probably jump into another book next week. I don't know what book we're going to jump into yet. I forgot to say it. The question was for the YouTube crowd, are we going to talk about the resurrection again next week? Because Easter is coming up. Only it's an Easter that no one's going to celebrate outside because we're all afraid of getting sick and we're going to be hiding inside. Another weird historical moment and a surreal thing. No, we probably aren't going to talk about the resurrection again. I think we're going to move on to another book. Any other comments or questions for tonight?
Well, actually, there's always the latter part of 28 and the importance of
Your mom has the thing on here.
commands to go, what we need to do.
Hmm. So the comment from Jim was about the importance of Jim. I assume you're talking about the Great Commission, the command to go and make disciples of all nations. So what are you seeing in there specifically that you wanted to discuss?
Well, I think the idea, the significance, the simple significance of making disciples,
Hmm.
continually teaching them, and doing more than just evangelists.
Yeah. So for the YouTube crowd, what Jim said was, it needs to be talked about how it's important to continue discipling and teaching people rather than just evangelizing them. And I would agree with that. Um, I was talking to my dad today about some sermon stuff that he had heard, and it made me think about how sometimes we don't take a critical look at what we're reading and we let somebody else interpret it for us. Um, and I would say it's fine to listen to other people, but you shouldn't let them do all the interpreting for you. I can be wrong about stuff. And in fact, I am wrong about stuff fairly often. I'm very good at finding all the ways that I'm wrong about stuff. So if you think I'm wrong about something, then there's no reason not to go and study it yourself and see. You need to study, you need to know what the content of the Bible is. And it's not, you know, some kind of magical, impossible, mystical script where you have to be, given the great position of pastor and teacher to understand. You just have to read it and study and find some context. And sometimes that's hard. But it is important to continue studying it and continue learning it because it has things to say beyond what we learn in like an evangelistic sermon or an evangelistic event. If all we ever had to do was go to Harvest Crusade festivals, then shoot, life would be easy and it would be pretty much done with this whole church thing. Yes, Lindsay.
Your mom said when she was watching the Ten Commandments, she noted the similarity of us hiding in our houses during Passover.
The similarities of us hiding in our houses during Passover. Yes, that is kind of interesting and ironic. Um, so that's ironic because the the time of year when Jesus was crucified was for Passover. Um, Only this time, instead of hiding from the angel of death, we're hiding from a virus that shall not be named. Because I simply refuse to talk about it anymore. Yeah, that's funny, Mom. Thanks for bringing that up. Oh, I haven't seen that joke. Joel mentioned that there's a joke about in order to protect yourself from the virus that shall not be named, you're supposed to put Chick-fil-A on the doorpost and lintel. Yes.
Your mom said Passover is April 8th through the 16th this year.
Yeah. So that's right about to start. Yep. Passover's coming up. Okay. Well,
Of course,
yeah.
a little bit of sidebar rabbit trail.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that the Western Church, the Orthodox Church,
Mm-hmm.
actually celebrates Passover and Easter at a different time
Mm.
because they calculated.
That is interesting. And that is a whole nother rabbit hole. So for YouTube, what Jim said was it's worth noting that the western side and eastern sides of the church, the Eastern Orthodox side and the western side, have different dates for the Passover, for resurrection, and for the actual crucifixion of Christ, which is really interesting because that's also part of the centuries-old debate about how to date Christmas. There's a whole long historical slog to get through with how did the argument over the dating of the crucifixion and therefore the resurrection affect designating December 25th as Christmas? Because they didn't just pick that from nowhere, right? The short version of it is based on the assumption that Jesus was conceived on the day he was killed. They came up with his birth date being December 25th. There's a whole lot more to it than that. This is definitely like the nutshell fortune cookie version. I'll find some interesting podcast links and post them. I posted them most recently around Christmas time, but I think I can go find them again. Anyway, the other side of that coin is that because the dating went from the crucifixion and the resurrection and the argument over that, so that influenced the dating for Christmas. It was after that date was settled on for the celebration of Christmas that the Romans decided to call December 25th the holiday for the celebration of Sol Invictus, which was a winter solstice holiday. So yeah, those two do coincide, but the coincidence didn't come from Christians trying to steal the holiday from Rome. It was just sort of, it was coincident. Yeah, Lindsay.
Your mom said dates according to Google don't know whether they align with East or West.
Yeah. I would have no idea whether or not Google understands the debate about resurrection dating. I assume they don't. In fact, I assume most people, most of the time in America, forget that the Eastern Church exists. I do.
That's true.
Yeah.
Of course, one of the things with the Eastern Church, they connect Easter more directly when Passover comes.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Passover being connected with the lunar calendar is going to be very different than the way we see it.
Yeah. So for YouTube, that was a comment from Jim about how the Eastern Church connects Easter, or the Eastern Church connects Easter and Passover more directly. And because that's on the lunar calendar, it's not necessarily obvious to those of us in the West who don't use a lunar calendar. Well, the East uses a solar calendar now too, but at the time, the Jews were on their lunar calendar. Okay, anything else before we cut off the stream here? All right. Well, I'll go ahead and end the stream here, and I'll let you guys know if we come up with a better way to do this whole streaming video and discussing things over Discord nonsense. We're working on it. We just haven't figured out how to make it work yet. Anyway, we will stop the stream here.